Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. Can I, I'm looking at the wrong video, can I welcome all of you to St John's Online this evening. This is the fifth of the Parent Reach talks we've done since the first lockdown on a range of different topics. I'm just going to share my screen with you. If you've got a propensity to do so, you can share your screen and then you can see the person speaking tonight and their talk. Let me just... hopefully, Suzanne, can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, brilliant, lovely. So, as I've said, this is part of the Parent Reach programme of talks that we've organised. We started off initially with, if you remember, for some of you who were able to join us, A Life in the Day of a St John's Boy. We were trying to contextualise what it meant to be a boy at St John's and to put that into context with the life of the Society of Jesus over 450 years. We then went on to giving a talk about understanding the subtleties, the differences of the secondary school curriculum for parents who were grappling with the choice of school for their sons. We then had a talk from Carl Hopwood on the internet, on the opportunities, dangers, and how we protect our boys, but particularly also give them the skills to get the best out of the internet. And then the last talk was on adolescence, given by Anne Barker, and we were joined by two of our old boys, John and Hugh. It gives me really great pleasure to welcome back, in many senses, Adrian Porter. He's not here in person. Adrian's going to join us online, obviously. For those of you who are well-established parents at St John's, Adrian will need no introduction. He was our chaplain until very recently, but also has overall responsibility on behalf of the province for all of the schools in the British province and also in Denmark. But Adrian talks tonight as a very experienced educator. He's been a headmaster of two very large secondary schools, one independent, one state. Very few people understand education and educational provision as well as Adrian, and particularly I can't think of anyone better to talk tonight about education and the Jesuit vision and context. So Adrian, thank you very much indeed for joining us this evening. Adrian's going to talk about Jesuit education and a window on the world. So if I stop sharing, Adrian, you're welcome to share your screen.
Okay, so I think we've achieved that. So good evening, everyone. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces and names on the screen, and it's lovely to be back at St John's, even just for a short time this evening. And I've been asked to talk a little bit about Jesuit schools, and the subtitle that I've chosen for this evening's reflection is A Window on the World. A few years ago, myself and a couple of friends hired a gîte in France, and off we went on holiday. And when we arrived at this gîte, which was on a farm, the farmer had clearly spent many years building this gîte himself, sort of changing this barn into this extraordinarily beautiful gîte. And he'd only just finished, and we were the first people in it. And he was afraid, really, I think, for us to touch anything at all. And so he and his wife literally showed us every knife, every fork, every chair, every cupboard, every switch, and explained how everything worked. And the four of us we were in that state of having fits of giggles because this was just so absurd. It was beautifully done, but we'd said this 100 times. And he's decided to show us the windows. So he started off from the first window and said, in reasonably good English, this is a window. And he showed us how it opened and how it closed. And then he went to the next one and said, and this is a window. And he showed us how it opened and how it closed. And he literally went on and on. And we were just absolutely giggling and giggling away, but trying not to be rude. And eventually he came to a mirror and he said, and this is a window. And we thought, oh, what's going on here? And he turned to us and looked us in the eyes and said, on your soul. And this was slightly scary, to be honest, and slightly frightening. And I thought, I'm not sure I really want a window on my soul or a window into myself. I think of windows as things that you look out of onto the outside world. And it seems to me that in that sense, a window is quite a good image for what schools try to do. Because at their best, what schools and education tries to do is to open windows to give children and young people all kinds of vistas onto all kinds of parts of the world and aspects of the world that you possibly can't experience for yourself directly, or certainly not at the age of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, or whatever it is. So that window on the world is good, I think. But it's also a window that goes both ways, as true windows do. It's not like the mirror, because windows allow people to look in. And one of the really interesting things working in Denmark with our school there is, if you walk down the streets in Denmark, the windows don't have net curtains on them. There's this social view in Danish society that people should be able to look in, should be able to see what's going on in your house, which is very strange to us, because in this country we tend to put up barriers and we don't want people looking in. But in a school, we do want people looking in. We want people looking in to see what's going on in the school and to see what they can contribute to what's happening in the school. So I think that whole idea of windows is really quite important. And when you think about St. John's as a very particular school, I wonder why you sent your children to St. John's. It was probably for all kinds of reasons. You wanted a good education, you wanted them to network and to meet other children, you wanted them to be ambitious, all kinds of different things, the sport, the music, all of those sorts of things you wanted. Maybe the religious character of the school was also part of what you wanted. But when you think about the reasons why parents choose a school, in my experience, when we used to run open days for prospective parents at the two schools of which I was a head, at the end of the evening, we'd have, because they were big schools, we would have somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 families would come through. And we would ask the parents, why are you thinking about Wimbledon College or St. Aloysius College for your children? And almost always they had met pupils, older pupils of our school, and they were able to say, I want my son or daughter to be something like that 18-year-old. There's something about the way that young adult has been formed and shaped, the attitudes they have, the way they hold themselves with regard to the world, that I'd like for my own child, in our case, coming into the school either at the age of 4 or at the age of 11. So what was it that you saw in the older pupils at St. John's that attracted you and you thought, I'd like some of that, I'd like something of that? And it seems to me that the kind of answer a Jesuit school tries to give is to say that there are two key aspects to education in the Jesuit tradition. And those two key aspects are the best education that we can give someone, the best learning that we can give someone, but also something around the formation of character. It's this question, what kind of human being, what kind of person do you want your son to be? Now, it's interesting that when Pope Benedict visited the UK in 2010, they held an enormous assembly for school children at St. Mary's University in London. And everybody was expecting the Pope to be a little distanced from these kids and not really get what children are about. And what he said was extraordinary. It had an extraordinary effect, 8,000 school children there. And he said, this is my question. This is the most important question. What kind of person do you really want to be? What kind of person do you really want to be? And then he said, and what qualities do you see in other people that you'd like to have for yourself? And psychologists will tell you that that is the most important question you can ask adolescents. So in a school like St. John's, we're sort of teeing up for that question. We're getting the boys to imagine, what kind of person do you want to be? What learning do you need for that? What character do you need for that? What virtue do you need for that? And so the way that we express that in the Jesuit schools is through this, which I'm sure you've all seen. We call it the Jesuit Pupil Profile. And what it's meant to do is that it's meant to articulate in a really clear way the sorts of qualities, the kind of person that we hope your sons will grow into in their time at St. John's. So the way we do things, the way we educate, the way we run the school, very consciously and very deliberately tries to plant and form these particular virtues in your sons. Now, obviously, it's a partnership. An enormous amount of this goes on at home and with parents, but the school also plays its role. And it's quite interesting that as children get older, the research shows that teachers become more and more influential. Sometimes as parents' influence sort of declines when kids get to 14, 15, 16, to that sort of age, you know, the parents are kind of left behind. They don't look to their parents for guidance on this sort of thing. But teachers, the research shows, are really very, very important. After parents, 16-year-olds report that 80% of 16-year-olds think that their teachers are the most important people who form their attitudes and their character. And sometimes we have to remind teachers about that because teachers can be slightly skeptical. Is that really true when we're dealing with adolescents? But if you look at these words, what you have is you have 8 pairs of virtues, 16 virtues in all, but they work in pairs. And we spent about 1.5 years talking to our schools, to the children, to the staff, to governors, families, and saying, if we had to ask you to actually name the qualities that you'd like to see in your sons and daughters when they come to the end of their time in a Jesuit school, what would those virtues be? And this is what we came up with. I have to tell you, it was completely different from what we thought it would be, but this is what we came up with. And some of these things are drawn from the Christian tradition of the gospel. Some of these things are drawn from our particular Jesuit tradition, the tradition of St. Ignatius Loyola, and the tradition of Jesuit schools through the last 500 years. But when you look at them, despite knowing that that's their provenance, that's where they've come from, I think any parent would want these for their child. We had an example recently where some parents came who were not religious. Certainly they weren't Catholics, they weren't religious. They were very skeptical. They wanted the school. We're not talking about St. John's, we're talking about a different school. They wanted the school, but they were quite skeptical. And eventually they asked the deputy head, well, can we just ask you an awkward question? You know, what do you do to our children? What happens to them here because you're a Jesuit school? And the deputy head simply put this pupil profile in front of them and said, that's what we do. And the parents looked at it and said, oh, that's all right then. They were mightily relieved that this is what was going to hopefully happen to their child, because these virtues tap into the very fundamental things that we'd like to see in our children and that we'd like to see in each other as adults. We want to be loving people. We want to be wise. We want to be compassionate and active and generous and eloquent. All of these things we want. And I think it shows religion at its best, because religion at its best taps into what is shared and universal among human beings. Religion at its worst separates and divides and excludes. So it seems to me there's something here that comes from our particular religious and spiritual tradition, but which is really shared and fundamental to all people who want to be good humans. It's Pope Benedict's question, what kind of person do you want to be? And I think if you look at the St. John's boys, you can see in all kinds of different ways these particular virtues growing in them. So just quickly to take a couple of examples. You see there we have the idea of being faith-filled, the idea of being hopeful, and the idea of being loving. Now those 3 virtues come directly from the Gospels, from the very earliest times when Christians have reflected on what does it mean to be a good person? What Christians tend to say, a Christian person, but it's broader than that, it's a good person. What does a good person look like? Well, I think they're somebody who has faith. They have faith in themselves, self-confidence. They have faith in their parents and their family, in the communities in which they live, in their nation, in the wider world, and ultimately maybe faith in God too. So at all those kind of different levels, a good person is a person who has faith in themselves and in others. I think a virtuous person is also somebody who has hope, somebody who's positive, somebody who has a positive take on the way things work. And again, psychology will tell you that, people who basically are pessimistic and lack hope have very, very different lives in the end to people who try and be hopeful in what they do. And then there's this idea of being loving, which I think we all relate to, this idea that loving is something very, very important in terms of being a human being. And in our tradition, one of the things that St. Ignatius Loyola observed was that people who thrive, you tend to see their faith, their hope, and their love growing. And people who are in difficulties, you see their faith and their hope and their love shriveling and reducing. And it seems to me, he talks about this as a test, a way of looking at whatever you're doing, whatever activity, if it's a relationship or an activity, something you do. He says, if you see yourself growing in faith, hope, and love, then this is a good thing for you. Do more of it. But if you notice in yourself, or if you're observing your child, your son or daughter, and you see their faith, their hope, and their love kind of diminishing, this is probably not good for them. And so it's probably good to do less of this. So these aren't just sort of slogans thrown up. There's a lot of psychology and there's a lot of spirituality behind this. So think maybe about those three things in particular. Just take another pair that we talk a lot about at St. John's is the idea of gratitude and generosity, being grateful and generous. And again, in the spirituality of St. Ignatius, he has these as a sort of bookends. He says that we should always try to be grateful. We should learn the habit of gratitude. And it makes such a difference. And it's something that even the youngest kids in the school can do, just to say thank you for things. And it changes relationships in the school. If people are in the habit of thanking each other for the little things that they do, it changes an atmosphere, it builds an atmosphere. I think it's true at home as well. Sometimes older children, adolescents can treat home almost though it's a hotel, take it all for granted. And that just being able to say thank you transforms the relationships. And then also Ignatius observed that if you learn to be a grateful person, then you tend to become a generous person. Once we start thanking people, we start giving our time, our energy, our resources. We tend to give, we're generous. And so those two things go together. So you can see, I think, just briefly, that gives you a sense of what we try and do in a Jesuit school. We articulate very, very clearly, this is the kind of person that we hope your son is going to be. And what we do in the school, in every single way, whether it's the teaching in a classroom or the religious life of the school or the sport or the drama, whether it's in the disciplinary system, whether it's in assemblies and encouraging the kids, this is the language we use consistently. We're not saying there aren't any other virtues. Of course there are other virtues and they're good virtues, but these are the ones that the boys hear time and time and time again. And so they begin to grow into this. Really, the originator of virtue theory is Aristotle. And if you look back at Aristotle says, he wrote this book called the Nicomachean Ethics. And sometimes I'd have to teach this at A-level to A-level philosophers. And on the first page of the Nicomachean Ethics, he asked this question: how do you become a good person? And sixth formers are quite interested in this question. And so they start reading the text, and the text is quite challenging. And by the time you get several hundred pages in and towards the end, Aristotle comes up with the answer. And he says, well, the way in which you become a virtuous person or a good person is by being a good person. And there'd always be a groan from the class at this point. We've read 200 pages just to tell us that. Of course, with Aristotle, it's the process of the thing that's important. But the point Aristotle is making is, if you want to be a grateful person, then say thank you. If you want to be an attentive person, then try and pay attention each day. Notice what's going on in your life. If you want to be a generous person, then practice giving every single day in some way, however small. And so that idea of building habits is important. And of course, that's what teachers and parents do all the time. You try and build up the habits in the children. And the way that works psychologically is you notice when children are doing these things, you remark on the fact that they're doing them, that gives them positive affirmation. And so they do more of it. If every time your child is grateful or generous, you say, well done, and you notice it, then they think, oh, that's a good thing to do. That's a good thing to be. And so it grows and it becomes who they are. It becomes their actual character. So at a sort of small scale, I suppose that's what we're trying to do in a Jesuit school. We're trying to form character through education, through what we do in the schools. Now, the other thing I really wanted to then say was, if you look at the Jesuit schools, there's a great danger that we look upon St. John's and just think about St. John's and its 185 students. But St. John's is part of a worldwide network. So there are 11 Jesuit schools in the UK. There are about 75 Jesuit schools in Europe. But if you go worldwide, there are around 2,500 Jesuit schools. There are also 200 Jesuit universities. And altogether, those schools and universities educate about 3.5 million students worldwide. So other than China, that is the largest coherent education system anywhere in the world. And because it has such reach, it affects whole countries and whole ways of thinking. And so your sons are a part of that worldwide vision for education, that worldwide idea of opening the windows, of having this window on the world. And one of the best things, I think, is when Jesuit schools swap. So, for example, a couple of years ago, we took a number of the St. John's boys to our school in Denmark, which was a real experience. And the Danish kids came over to St. John's. One of the highlights for me is the headmaster came with us on this occasion, and we spent a day going around the canals and things of Denmark. And we got to the end of the day, and these were what I think they were 10-year-olds, weren't they? 10, 11-year-olds, that sort of age anyway. And at the end of the day, the teacher who was showing us around, it was 3 o'clock. We were in the middle of the city of Denmark, of Copenhagen. And the teacher in charge said, well, right, boys, we'll see you all tomorrow. And Giles looked at me sort of panicking, and what did he just say? And all the kids got on boats or bicycles or trams or trains and just went home, because it's unheard of for 10-year-olds in Denmark to be met by their parents and taken home. This would be regarded as extraordinary. And they all just happily make their way home. Whereas for us, I think we might be filling out risk assessments. So it's great to be part of that wider network across the world. And a few years ago, the Jesuits, we're a religious order in the Catholic Church, and about 16,500 of us. So we're a big order with a lot of big institutions and quite a lot of impact around the world. We started thinking, in this modern world that we inhabit, what do we most want to be doing? And this affects the schools, because if we've got 2,500 schools, including some really important universities, what do we want them to be doing? Apart from doing really good education, and apart from doing this character forming, so we produce really good people who are virtuous and make a difference in their communities, what is it that we really want to focus on? And we came up really with 4 areas. And you can see in the bottom right-hand corner here, you can see this whole area of accompanying the young. This is our work in education. This is our work with young people in the universities. And it's this idea of walking with them, accompanying them as they make sense of the future. What we're handing over as adults to them is a world which is, frankly, both fantastic and wonderful, but also, frankly, in a bit of a mess. So how do we help them to be filled with hope for their future? So that's very much become part of what we try to do. If you go round the circle to the second of our priorities, you see in green there, this idea of our common home. This is a phrase that Pope Francis uses a lot. This idea that we need to take responsibility for our planet, and that we need to do something to make our care of the planet much, much more serious. Now, I learned the hard way that this absolutely happens at St. John's, because a couple of years ago when I was living there, we took some of the boys out to cook their supper in the woods one evening. And the headmaster sent me off to Sainsbury's to buy the mincemeat and so on. So I bought the mincemeat for the burgers and brought all this stuff back. And we cooked the food and they had a great time and so on. It got to the end of the evening. So I bundled up all the plastic and all the rest of it. And I threw it on the fire, not thinking, well, you'd think I'd murdered my granny. These kids turned on me and they said, you can't burn plastic. That's ruining the environment. And they were really aggressive. So I did what all teachers do, which is try to say, make a joke of it. And one of them turned to me and in all seriousness said, it's not funny, you'll be dead, but we have to live on this planet. So I learned my lesson. The young can sometimes be eco-terrorists in that sense, but that's probably good for us, those of us who are a bit older. But this is, again, one of our focuses, and it's something that we would want to do at St. John's. And then the top left there, the blue corner, is this idea of showing a way to God. Our schools come from a religious tradition and have done for 500 years. And we're trying to say that a relationship with God, and a relationship with God that tries, this is the word discernment, to make the right choices for our planet, for our society, for ourselves, is really important. And again, through things like retreats and the religious life of the school, that's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to force it on anyone. We're not trying to say there is one religion or one way of doing this. There are many ways of doing this. But we're trying to simply open that up and allow children to experience that from themselves. And then as they grow up, they'll make their own decisions. And then lastly, the Jesuits have always tried to walk with the poor, to try and look at the least privileged people in our society. So one of the things that we're very proud of those 2,500 Jesuit schools worldwide, a growing number of those, something like 200 of them now, are in refugee camps. So we have deliberately gone to refugee camps and set up schools to educate the children of refugees. And some of those kids are in the schools for a day or 2 days before they move on. Some arrive thinking they're in temporary settlement and they find their entire education over 15, 16 years is in the camps. A number of years ago, we set up something called the Jesuit Refugee Service, and people from that service regularly talk at St. John's, and St. John's is involved with that. It's now the largest refugee agency working for the United Nations, among others. And it's that idea of showing a solidarity with people whose dignity has been violated, people who are really on the edges of things. Now in Britain, we're, despite people crossing the channel in tiny, tiny numbers, we're largely isolated from all of that. But in some of our Jesuit schools, we have 3 schools on the island of Malta. And for the last decade, I've been doing the training for the teachers there. On one day that I was there 2 years ago, before COVID, on one day, 8,000 refugees arrived on the island. So care of refugees there is very real. And our schools there, our older students work with a lot of those refugees. So those are quite radical in a way, but they also plug into what Jesuits have always tried to do down through the centuries. I suppose what we're trying to do is, in the people we work with and through our institutions, just like St. John's Beaumont, what we're trying to do is, in a way, to create people who are holy. Now, one way of thinking about that is this. But possibly you don't think of your own son in this way. And certainly I wouldn't have thought of this particular St. John's boy in that way. And he would be laughing if he knew I was showing you this right now. But this idea of being holy is one of the things that Benedict talked about when he was giving that talk at the big assembly and asking, what kind of person do you really want to be? He was saying, well, some of the people that we admire, we call saints. They're people who've lived in ages before us who were good people, who made a difference. Some of them gave their lives for something important. So he was saying, who are going to be the saints of tomorrow? And the answer was, well, you are. some of you. You know, how are you going to be a person who is different, who makes the world a better place? And that ultimately is what the word saint means. It comes from a Latin word for holy, and holy comes from a Hebrew word, which simply means different. And I think ultimately that's what we want for the St. John's boys. We want them to be different in a way that makes the world a better place. And so that's why we do education in Jesuit schools the way we do. We're not primarily about getting good jobs or getting good qualifications, although those can be really helpful things along the way. What we're primarily about is using our talents and energies to the best, AMDG, so that this world in which we live, and particularly for the least fortunate in our world, so that all those people can enjoy the life that God gives them. That's what we're about in Jesuit education and in Jesuit schools. So I'm going to stop there. I was asked to speak for about half an hour, and oops, what have I done?
Adrian, thank you very much. Indeed, I think as I suspected and knew you had every confidence you would, you've kind of unpacked, I think, the distinctive element of not just St. John's, but Jesuit schools worldwide. I think a number of things that you mentioned kind of resonated with what we've spoken about as a school to the boys recently, and on occasions to parents. We talk a lot to the boys about forming habits, sorry, just turn my, oh, hello, are you there? Okay, no problem, thanks, cheers, thanks. Father Porter's just apologised, his computer's crashed. He'll be joining us in a couple of minutes. So Mrs. Lawton, if you can keep an eye out for him. We talk to the boys a lot about forming habits and saying to the boys, simply doing something good for someone doesn't mean you're a good person. If we have to put an entire framework around it and remind you to be good and have you sign it in your homework diary, then a good action doesn't define a good particular person. But of course, the more we do that, then the more the boys become instinctive in their habits and their actions. And so hearing Adrian talk about that, I think really resonates with what we are trying to encourage the boys to do. Of course, the Jesuits talk a lot about living and learning, and their many hundreds of years of experience in educating and forming schools is one thing, but having that element of teaching the boys to live virtuous lives is important. But also the one thing we've started over recent months and years to talk to the boys is this idea of critical thinking. And you might have noticed the word that Adrian mentioned in the Jesuit pupil profile about discernment, and this sense of trying to give the boys an experience of what it means to lead. And being a leader isn't simply exercising power, it's exercising influence. And we don't need to give boys power in order for them to exercise influence. And a good example of that is every day of our lives, we come into conflict with people. Our boys certainly come into conflict sometimes with each other, and I'm sure as adults we come into conflict. But an Ignatian way of living and this sense of discernment encourages us to try and step into somebody else's shoes. I see it day after day with my own girls, occasionally when they'll fall out with each other, and simply, more often than not, it's a misunderstanding and a miscommunication where one person has meant something, but one of the other girls has interpreted it in a different way. And trying to give the boys this sense of space and maturity and confidence to be able to step into each other's shoes and find a different way of looking at a conflict and therefore finding a resolution. That is the most powerful example of leadership that we can possibly give the boys. Putting a tie around their neck and calling them captain of something is one way. But in this way, our boys in year 3, in year 4, and year 5 can also develop this sense of what it means to lead. And all of this stems from the Jesuit pupil profile and the virtues there. Adrian, are you back?
I am, yes. Sorry about that. Computer died at just the wrong moment.
or the right moment, one might say. ladies and gentlemen, just before Adrian goes, I just wondered if there were any questions that anyone would like to ask at this particular point. If there are, I think you all have the capacity to unmute yourself. So yes, you do. So are there any questions at this point? I hope those of you who have registered early have enjoyed your glass of wine. I've certainly enjoyed some of mine. Adrian's been on water, but I think that's for everyone's benefit, not just his. Are there any questions? I think once again, Father Porter, your comprehensiveness has outdone us all. If there aren't any questions, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you very much indeed for taking the time and trouble to join us. I hope this evening has just given you particularly a different angle and perspective on why we do what we do at St John's. We don't run an activity program here simply to make the longest list of different activities. The activity program here exists to fulfill a very important characteristic, and Adrian spoke a moment ago about character education and encouraging boys to try something new and see success and enjoyment in trying something new, something they might be vulnerable in. That's deeply rooted in what it means to be an Ignatian school as well. So hopefully when we do some of these rather quirky and idiosyncratic things, maybe Adrian's talk now will have given us a bit more sense of why we do what we do. Adrian, thank you ever so much indeed for joining us. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking the time and trouble to join us as well. I hope I'll see you before the end of term in the drop-off or collection. But in the meantime, have a lovely evening. Thank you very much.